Genetic information provides information about others in addition to the individual whose samples were taken. For example, if an individual tests positive for a genetic condition, then not only is this information relevant for family members who may wish to be tested themselves, but also for sexual partners who may need the information when making reproductive decisions. It also gives information about other family members which those family members may not yet have and indeed may not yet want, as the debates about the right to know and not to know discuss. For instance, if a child tests positively for a genetic condition, then this reveals the positive status of the parent. In short, the key feature of genetic information is that it's typically information about a family or even about a larger community, and not just about an individual patient. Accordingly, decisions regarding the use of genetic material no longer can be regarded as only of concern to the individuals from whom samples are taken. Disclosure of genetic information by individual DNA donors also exposes information about those with similar genetic profiles. This argument applies across the spectrum of genetic ethics, from clinical ethics, where genetic tests reveal information about family members, to population ethics, where tests on one member of a group, especially a group with relatively homogeneous genetic profiles, such as an indigenous group, reveal information about other members of the group, to biobanks, where the potential of identification and revelation extends into the future. In all instances, there are questions about the practicality of the individual model. Because genetic information is identifying, it's simply not possible to guarantee confidentiality in the genetic era. And ethically, if genetic information is identifying of third parties, then shouldn't we consider their interests in any adequate ethical framework? In sum then, for both practical and ethical reasons, the individual model is being questioned, and this has led to a general rethinking of the paramount position of the individual in ethics, and this is where we are now. In order to overcome such problems, new ethical approaches have been developed and are still being sought. Approaches which respect third-party rights are emerging from clinical ethics to biobanking, and particularly in population genetics. In all of these areas, the main concern has been how to ensure that the rights of all individuals with legitimate interests are taken into account. The primary concern across the board is to ensure that those with relevant interests, and not just the individual from whom samples are taken, are considered. As Greeley notes, the identifying nature of genetic material means that genetic research on one member of the group has implications for all members, whether or not they decided or were even asked to take part in research. This has been particularly problematic in population genetics, although there are parallel cases in clinical genetics. The classic case is that of the Hagaya tribe, although there are others, for instance the Solomon Islands and Panama. To put it most simply, in these cases, samples were taken from a small number of individuals, sometimes even only one individual, and then patents were granted on the DNA of the tribe, although in these cases later disclaimed. For this paper, the details of the particular cases isn't important, although I have written about them elsewhere. What is crucial is that even if practices of informed consent have been properly implemented, this would not have addressed the group issues. Moreover, it is not just an issue about the rights and interests of current members of the group, but there are also communal and future goods to be considered, such as genetic heritage and shared ownership. Goods such as these cannot be protected by individual consent alone, and arguably not by consent processes at all, given the future elements of such goods. As when it comes to genetic heritage, and I quote, the responsibility for its use and management in accordance with Indigenous laws and traditions must be borne by the community as a whole. If such goods are to be protected, as well as the rights of related third parties, then additional models are needed. It is injustices to third parties, both current and future, which individual practices of consent cannot address, and it is these that are driving the reassessment of ethical models. Biobanks present additional challenges. Like clinical ethics and population research, related individuals are implicated To quote, just as in other areas, the risks of biobank research go beyond the individual human subjects to population groups with which the subject is associated, as well as the general public. However, there are additional problems to add to the third-party problem. The first is that biobanks are typically open-ended with an emphasis on future research which is not yet determined. Thus, the exact research to be carried out on an individual samples and or data is as yet unknown and may even be wholly unforeseen. If we look at UK Biobank, the open-ended nature of the project is clear. Its stated purpose is to build a major resource that can support a diverse range of research intended to improve the prevention, diagnosis and treatment of illness and the promotion of health throughout society. So too is the future-orientated emphasis, as participants are invited on the basis that participation is an opportunity, and I quote, to contribute to a resource that may, in the long term, help enhance other people's health. Very obviously then, consent to participate in a biobanking project of this sort cannot be informed in any real sense of the word, and thus cannot fulfil the standards required of consent. To quote, whereas clinical research has specific aims, the aims of a biobank may be vague or non-existent at the time of the participant's donation to the biobank. The second additional problem relates to recontact. In the usual model, individuals are asked to give consent and allow their samples and or data to be used for a specific research project. If the researcher wishes to reuse the samples, then they must go back to the person and ask them to reconsent for the additional study. Biobank projects are not a single study or even a suite of studies. Rather, they are a resource, a kind of research library for many, many, many studies. To require reconsent in this context would be impractical and overly burdensome both on researchers and donors. So in response to these problems, new models are arising as alternatives and supplements to individual practices. Group and communal models which are arising include versions of group consent, benefit sharing and trust. For instance, attaining group consent is now being viewed as best practice and, to quote Ruth, is essentially an ethical prerequisite. Likewise, benefit sharing is a frequently used model which respects the wider community and recognises the impact of research on communities as well as on individual participants. In biobanking, the trend has been to adopt broad consent models and supplement them with additional ethical and governance mechanisms, often understood or described as a trust model. The participant agrees to their material being used not for specific research, but in accord with some kind of general principle or stated purpose. The trust model is what it says on the tin. The participant trusts the biobank to use the data as they have promised. Thus, to quote David Winnicott, when a person agrees to donate tissue, the recipient has a responsibility to serve as a trustee or steward of the tissue in order to ensure protection of the contribution. And it is a version of this model which UK Biobank has adopted. The additional protections which supplement broad consent, in this instance being the EGF and the EGC. All of these models I've explored in detail elsewhere. Key for this paper today is that either alone or in conjunction or with individual processes, they address at least some of the concerns of genetic ethics, especially when we think of this as a global ethic. However, they are not yet systematically embedded. It is still possible to claim to have acted ethically when only individual consent has been sought. The next stage, the future of bioethics, is as yet unclear. My hope is that we will continue to develop and implement a framework that can address bioethics. I hope I have shown you why we have the model that we have and why it's no longer effective. Essentially, it only addresses one type of injustice, injustice to the individual when the individual is considered as an isolated, separate agent. In doing so, it in fact fails to prevent harms to individuals as communal and group harms also result in individual harm. In this paper, I focused on genetic ethics. However, this critique has a much wider application, and I've written elsewhere about context and structural problems, rendering the individual consent process ineffective, for example, in organ sale. While the individual model is inadequate, I think, in all areas if used alone. In the areas we have discussed, this is particularly the case. When we look to the future and the need for global ethical frameworks, the context and structural pressures on individuals become more acute and add weight to the calls for ethical frameworks which recognise relational and context-related pressures on individuals. Thus, the claim is that for bioethics to ensure ethical practice, the communal turn needs to be consolidated in areas such as population genetics, where it is already strong. And it needs to be introduced in areas where the individual model alone is still effectively the only ethical practice. If this is not done, then current best practice will allow unethical situations and will ignore injustices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you so much for keeping to time. So that gives us perhaps 3 or 4 minutes for questions before coffee.
Heather, do you think there's a difference between saying bioethics should be global and saying bioethics should focus on global issues, paradigms and concerns? Because when I hear people say bioethics should be global, I immediately think of the thing that you then said people criticise, which is the idea almost of bioethical colonialism from the West. Whereas actually the point you were making was more nuanced than that, that actually bioethics should engage with, focus on, look at, communicate with the different topics. So I just wonder if there's some value in thinking about the nuance of the way we express the global.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. As Donna mentioned, I spent time working on issues of neo-colonialism, and yeah, I'm not a fan of colonialism in the old or new forms. So yes, so the aim is not to produce one, what I think actually informed consent is a form of neo-colonialism. I think it's inappropriate for lots of reasons I didn't discuss in all kinds of ways for that kind of fear of colonialism. So what I'm after is a global framework that has an ability to incorporate all kinds of different tools and recognise all kinds of different forms of injustices. So it hopefully should be representative rather than colonial.
I wonder if you could say a bit more just whether the communal turn encompasses both interwoven and interlinked, necessarily interlinked individual interests, as well as something that can supervene on that, which is a group interest, but isn't necessarily something that breaks down.
Yeah, I think it does, but I think some models do more than others. Like there's a sense in which something like group consent is simply kind of a widening of the individual model. So it still thinks of the group as lots of different individuals. So it doesn't do communal goods in that way, whereas something like benefit sharing does do communal goods because you can respect things like, environmental degradation, group ownership, all kinds of goods that are they're not aggregate goods. You're not putting the individual's goods together and making one big good. You're actually making a claim that there are types of goods that need to be respected for a community to thrive, and if they're not, individuals will still suffer. I mean, the only reason we worry about communal goods is because we worry about harms to individuals. But there are different types of communal goods, some of which are aggregate, they're individual rights shoved together to make a great big right, and some of which are actually attained to the group qua group rather than individuals shoved together.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask a bit about the story about consent and confidentiality. So I wondered if it was the case that first of all about consent. I wondered if it was the case that consent had been introduced primarily or as the overriding means of protecting the individual against exploitation,